Well, my entire career has been in international development, and I've worked with a lot of leaders over the years. I've been involved with G20 finance ministers, and I've been involved with other figures such as Prince Al Hassan of Jordan and Tony Blair, and I was involved with Gordon Brown and also Nicolas Sarkozy. So these are all people who have helped to shape some of my views about what I think may be lying ahead in terms of the global political and economic situation. The individual ethic is actually competing against the whole. And the whole often suppresses the individual. So the epistemology has to go forward to recognize that in order to balance the individual and the collective, we can't have this political dialogue between political left and political right, but whether the government should be more or less involved in the market. That doesn't frame the issue. It doesn't show the fact that both the government and the market are exploiting the commons. So the commons is a much more embracing aspect of the epistemology. It's the only way we can, in my view, resolve the epistemological crisis that we're in by this left and right debate. And because ultimately the political left and right ideology does come down to left and right hemispheres in the human brain. And therefore, it does behoove us to give some quarter to the epistemology behind that. Given that, the commons is emerging as a really all-encompassing vision of what's possible to link ways of bringing the state, the ideals of the state, which are largely equality and justice, and the ideals of the market, which is individual freedom. So again, the collective and the individual, bringing it down to the local level, where people can reclaim that sense of equality and justice, on one hand, through their co-governance of their resources, and the individual freedom through the co-production of their resources at local levels. This is what's missing, and it's missing in a lot of the debate that is emerging right now about how to frame the commons as political accountability structures. And there are various ideas around this, but my sense is that once we've recognized, looking for those diagrams, once we've recognized the necessity to emphasize the human mind and the fact that the mind represents the self, and our emphasis on nature and society are very objectified. And once we've been able to get that more holistic recognition of self into the mix, then I think we're able to recognize that there's also a kind of triarchical structure that we're talking about between trusts and governments and markets. And to break ourselves out of the dualism that is crippling us, epistemologically and also in terms of economic, social, political policy. So the commons is a bridging metaphor here, and actually it's more than a metaphor, it's actually a structural principle, because for the first time we're recognizing that you can really do a vision of unity based on the fact that some resources are not replenishable, they're depletable resources, and the fact that some resources are replenishable. And how do you put those two things together? Because economics has never been able to figure that out. There's always been the appeal to externalities. The commons shows us that we can put them both together, because the commons is not just the natural resources and material resources as we normally think of commons, but it's now beginning to break through with what we are calling social capital, and but it really, society is a commons, culture is a commons, the ideas that we have are commons, intellectual property that is, and digital space is certainly a commons, our genetics are commons. So what are we doing? We're looking at these issues as single issues, But they're really, I mean, NGOs have recognized for a long time that the interdisciplinary nature of the issues has to be recognized, and they have to be brought together. But the Commons is a framework that is able to do that. So my appeal is to NGOs and to business and government to begin to recognize the open source models that are emerging from the digital world as a real driving metaphor for what's possible at the local levels and also the regional levels, and really ultimately the global level, because here's the great disruptor, it seems to me, or one of them, in reckoning how we move forward. The individual stress in Western liberalism has always been on ownership, and I think the more collective or holistic vision now is moving towards stewardship and trusteeship of resources rather than ownership. That's one of the disruptors. But the other one that I think operationalizes that, and it's being driven by technology, it's being driven by our application of technology, but I think it's being driven by a larger force, which you could call evolutionary, which is that the resource users are becoming the producers of their own resources. And this model is breaking everything down, or at least it will eventually. But right now, the commoners have discovered that principle, and they're moving forward with it. So now if we have the irreducible fact of economics that there are depletable resources and replenishable resources, now we have a way of holding them together in a broader framework, which recognizes that that the only way that the economics of the past would work were through centralized decision-making structures, hierarchies, and now we have to go to a much more horizontal kind of decision-making, and that truly is what the Commons is representing. And again, last point is that you see this popping up all over the place, not only with Occupy, but many NGOs are coming to the realization, it seems to me right now, that the management of management and co-production of resources leads to that kind of missing piece that's always been in Western liberalism about how do you get to the point of policies that have that ontology that engages people in the moment, that delivers services directly and immediately to people, and we don't have to wait on time lags in the marketplace, the business cycle. We don't have to wait on bureaucratic inertia and red tape. Now we can have the expression of the ideals from the market, which is individual freedom. We can have the ideals of the state, which is equity and social justice. We can actually express those at the local levels. And the Commons seems to be the bridging formula that is making that possible.
So I'm going to talk 5 minutes about one potential thing that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out here, which is money. As whether, and the overarching question, of course, of today is for discussing how the concept of the commons as an organising principle and so on, as well as an epistemology, might help us communicate and discuss and explore how to reform money. And it's the less obvious one, perhaps, than Annual's presentation following about natural commons, because this is a social commons, I suppose you could say. Now, I don't know how many of you, well, I do know that some of you are experts in the whole question of money, but for those that aren't, it might not be immediately obvious how you could describe money as a commons. So I'll just briefly explain how it might be. And I'm not going to explore the morality of whether we should have money as a means of exchange and versus gift economies and generalised exchange or anything like that. This is assuming a modern economy that has money. Well, the key is this. Money has, as some of you will know, has several functions. One is a unit of account. One is as a store of value. The other is as a medium of exchange. Now, I'm going to talk about the function as a medium of exchange, something that facilitates us to exchange. Because it is that aspect of money which I believe actually is a social commons. And so, you know, if you go right back into history, as David Graeber, for example, did in his book, Debt the First 5,000 Years, you discover that money didn't arise spontaneously as gold or anything else that had intrinsic value from barter. It actually was a system of accounting, a system of recording social relationships of credit and debt, a way of somebody somewhere recording the fact that I'd produced 10 bushels of wheat and deposited them in the central thing, and therefore I should be able to exchange it at some point in the future for an equivalent value. Okay, it's just a way of recording. So this here, which is a pound coin, for those of you who've not seen one before, is just a token. It is a token. I mean, everybody knows that there's no gold in this. It's gold coloured, but it clearly has no intrinsic value whatsoever. It is a token. I can use it to buy things only because the state, which is only us collectively, agrees that we can, right? It is a token. And the money, and of course now it's more, I should be waving a phone at you because of course really most of it's on your bank balance in digital. It's digital tokens in your bank account. Our current system has privatized the creation of these tokens through a system that means that new money can only really be, well, 97% of it at least, can only be spent into the economy if somebody borrows it from a bank at interest. And we're sort of so used to that most people, I know some people in this room are very aware of it, but as a communication point, one of the things we try to do is explain that this is how money is actually created. But that's a very difficult conversation to have with conventional economists or the person on the street because it's quite esoteric, it's very abstract, it's quite hard to explain to them either that banks could really create money out of thin air, which they don't really want to believe, or that even that should matter to them, or that might be one of the reasons why we are exceeding our environmental limits, or that might be one of the reasons why we have severe inequality. These are all very, very hard concepts to explain. And so I'm quite interested in exploring the extent to which recasting this issue is very much a question in the Commons might be helpful. And just to sort of put how important it is that these tokens, that you should have enough of them in the right hands. You know, I mean, there's a story about the Great Depression in the US in the 1930s that may be a sort of apocryphal story, but I'm sure it probably happened, that you had a family sort of on the side of the road, homeless, with hungry children, whilst a few miles up the road, farmers pouring milk down the drains because there was no market for their milk. Now, I think James mentioned something about this earlier on. You know, an abstract, socially constructed thing, money, has got between the milk and the hungry child, and that seems ridiculous. Well, it doesn't seem ridiculous, it is ridiculous. And you look at Greece today. Post-financial crisis, Greece has the same amount of sunlight falling on it, the same number of olive groves, and the same number of fish in the sea, or what have you. The people are just as creative as they were before, probably more now. And so if all those resources are the same, why is it in such desperate trouble? Well, because the financial system has let it down, and fundamentally what it doesn't have is enough of these tokens to use as means of exchange. The economy has broken down because of that. So it's clearly a very important function, money as a means of exchange, and in order to get us from a system which breaks down in the way I've just described, those two examples, US in the 1930s, Greece today, to get away from a system where it's currently produced as money, as debt, interest-bearing, I wonder whether it might be more helpful to try to introduce the idea of the Commons into the question of reforming money and finance. But that's the question which we're sort of looking to discuss later on. So thank you very much.
People don't think of fish as a public resource that they should benefit from. For too many years, this has been given away as a gift to people to make money out of it, without thinking what society can claim back from it. In some healthy fisheries, like in the United States, fishermen pay sometimes 80% of the value that they get from their fishery in terms of rents that are paid back to society. Europe is far from that because most of the stocks are still overexploited. But in the future, if we get to a sustainable management of those resources, there is a case to say all those benefits should go back to society in some form. But there is a big debate on reclaiming that ownership or that right from the people that have it now, because then they can challenge governments and take them to legal action. So there is a fear. I mean, I know that for sure that the UK government is scared of reclaiming that right from people that own it now. And there is this famous example of sleeper skippers, so people that don't fish anymore, that are just like making money out of the right to fish by selling it and leasing it to other people. It's even claimed as a, I don't know, it's been proved yet that Manchester United owns some fishing quota and they make money out of it, leasing it to others. So it raises some questions, and I think it's an interesting process now, because we're seeing the privatization of a common resource as it happens, and the public in Europe, in the middle of I'm taking Europe as an example, in the middle of a huge economic crisis where public resources should be delivering for society, I think it creates a positive context to rethink how some of these solutions are put in place. So it can be an interesting example or illustration where the commons as a theme can be used to do that.
I'm just going to say one very brief thing about where NEF, New Economics Foundation, is overall in terms of its work to relate it to the commons, and then we'll open it up for debate. The work here is run through particular programs, program teams. Two of their heads are here, so Anil's work on environmental economics and Tony's work on finance and business. But in addition to that, we're very aware a few years ago, as many people are in different organisations, that whilst we might be able to pick off particular victories in each of those areas, there is a bigger battle to be had, and it was trying to get to grips, as many other organisations have, with what you do about that. How you can actually get transition within the frame in which those debates are had is a critical part of that. And we have what we refer to as the Great Transition as being part of what we're collectively trying to achieve. And we do work on, we actually have a work developing a systems dynamic economic model, actually, as one of the methods of us being able to analyse that. But also we do work around campaigns and movement building around that idea of a great transition. And in a way, that's where this debate or round table is going to be very helpful for us, to be able to look at it, to say what role can we work with the idea of the commons to be able to deliver that. And I come back to those two questions that I was opposing. Seeing as completely dominant conventional economic thinking in the media and in politics and everywhere is the neoliberal one that we face. If the idea of the commons is a disruptor to that, as James was explaining why it was, where are the places that we can use it the best, most realistically? Where's the most realistic chance that we can actually do work on it, use it as a concept to be able to deliver that change? So where is it most effective as a disruptor right now? And the second thing more broadly is, whilst we can sit in a room and talk about the commons, and many of us may know that idea or be able to come at it from different angles, how do you convert that into being something that ordinary people, voters, people reading the media, people responding on Facebook, Twitter, whatever else, can actually get hold of it as an idea and actually relate to it and say, yeah, that makes sense. In the same way that the neoliberal project ended up with in the 1970s of developing those ideas of like free markets and personal choice and things that people just said, I want that as a basic idea, I can really relate to it. How do you convert the commons and what we do in the work we do to actually deliver that, so that becomes a sort of, yeah, that's right, I get that. How do we actually do that work? So it's very much in the rather than theoretical, in the practical about how we take things forward, be a really useful debate, certainly for us here at NEF.
The question of money has a parallel debate at the international level, because the international monetary system will break down in the next, within the next years. And therefore, if we have something similar imposed on the world monetary system as we've had in the past, like a gold standard or a fiat currency, which with America as the dollar hegemon, which is in effect an oil standard, providing value to global currency. If we have something like that in the future, this is going to be a real tragedy. And therefore, it seems to me that the debate that's happening about alternative currencies and barter at local levels is very, very important. But I think that debate's still in its infancy. And you're right to really differentiate the three aspects of money, because we really need to get that clearly in frame, because the alternative currency movement is all over the board in terms of how they issue their money. And yet at the same time, we want the maximum diversity, but with local people deciding how that would go. But what I'm getting at is that the two tracks at the international and the local levels are really going to converge at some point, because because the model that I've been introducing to the G20 finance ministers, was at their meeting a few weeks ago, and it's one alternative model that they're looking at. And you know, I don't know why they're asking me to come to those meetings, but they want to pick my brain, I think, on these issues. But it's because I've been talking about using the commons as a basket of reserve assets that could give value to an international standard of value to which each individual country could peg their own currency. So there wouldn't be a global currency, but it would be a standard that we could use that would actually provide a monetary standard of value. And then at the local levels, people who don't want to use that can are totally free to, you know, to barter or to create some sort of alternative exchange system. My sense is that the commons movement could really benefit from a political party that really addressed issues such as assets and wealth, because that's something that that takes the commons from the fringes right into the mainstream. Having a clear policy on you know, how safe are my assets, and what about this degrowth movement? And what do you mean growth is bad? And in really addressing that in terms of a new kind of wealth that could be created, and also the fact of political accountability, because the commons movement is talking about creating these new political accountability structures at local levels. Begin to talk about how we're all dissatisfied with the accountability of government as it has been provisioning goods and services. And also, the key one, I think, is job creation, because peer-to-peer job creation is a real tangible possibility in the future, and I think that would excite voters very much. What do you mean job creation? I don't see any evidence of it, but yet when the resource users are becoming the producers of their own resources, if we had that other monetary system in place, either, you know, not maybe from the large sense, but in the local sense, then we can talk meaningfully about job creation in a new way. I don't think a political party is ready to embrace that as a debate right now, but I do see that emerging in the next few years as a real issue. And the last point from a political platform would be conservation, because this is something that I think appeals to lots of people.
I was thinking about this before we came in, and I dusted off a very old report that we did about 10 years ago, which we called The Limits to Property, the Failure of Restrictive Property Regimes in the Modern World. We kind of dipped back to Plato and Aristotle, and it made me think that this kind of grand struggle between the public sphere and the private sphere is as old as civilization itself, and the struggle over the border between the two is ever thus. And I think for me, I find it kind of quite useful to think in terms of the fact that even when we talk about the commons, obviously this is not a monolithic entity, that there are multiple ways of managing common resources, whether you talk about, you know, user rights or time-limited rights or whatever. There's lots of different regimes that you can imagine for the intelligent management of common resources. But thinking more about that, it came back in answer to Tim's question. Two things came back to me. One is that in configuring a new kind of politics around a more inclusive and progressive management of common domains, that we can afford at the moment to be incredibly confident, and we should be incredibly confident, because we're standing in the midst of the rubble of the failure of the alternative, if you like. You know, the transparent and obvious and functional breakdown of market-based systems which excessively privilege individual property rights within this. And when you trip through the issues, the way in which the right mounted an effective assault on the left, and I know we're talking about coming up with a new typology to discuss these sorts of issues in the 70s and 80s, by explicitly talking about the loony left and what, you know, the boroughs of Lambeth got up to, etc., etc., etc. The ways in which you can talk to things which speak to the common sense about the failure of existing property rights regimes, whether that's in terms of the extremes of homelessness on the one hand and 800,000 properties standing empty in the United Kingdom on the other, whether that's through unaffordable drugs and surplus profits in pharmaceutical companies and the deaths of children around the world on the other, whether that's about transboundary pollution issues on climate change, whether it's around access to water and the failure of fee-based, marketised, privatised water systems wherever you are in the world, whether it's about the internet, as you were saying, and people's instinctive sense now, this expectation that things should be there and should be shared and should be free, or whether it's about the money system, as Tony was pointing out, and the fact that people didn't even realise that we gift to the banks the right to benefit, massively profit from the privilege of being able to kind of print their own money, which we then have to pay a lot for. So it strikes me that apart from anything else, that you can speak in examples which mean things to people, which connect with people, both emotively and intellectually. And there's a moment now where we can be incredibly confident, and we should be shouting and ridiculing the failure of the property regimes which have failed us so demonstrably at the moment. We should be really on the, sort of, to use a cricketing analogy, on the front foot with this. And I think as a potential suite of issues for political mobilisation, they absolutely speak to the pub debate, absolutely speak to being able to communicate to people in a language that everybody can understand without needing to draw down any technical, political, theorising language. That was my tuppence halfpenny.
There were two very interesting Victorians. One was called Octavia Hill, and one was called Robert Hunter. Together they came together to preserve the Commons of London. We may be sat on a former common here. And I feel their kind of spirit on my shoulder every day in a strange way, because what they kind of stood for and tried to do is still resonating today. And what they were trying to do was to keep something very tangible and very real and make it available to ordinary people like us. And that was an enormous struggle. And Robert Hunter fought for 10 years of his lifetime just to preserve one common, Epping Forest, which was going to be chopped down and turned into an agricultural land. Perish the thought. And he realised then that he couldn't do this every 10 years, fight a battle for one common being lost. So he invented with Octavia Hill something called the National Trust, which I think most people may have heard of. But the origins of the National Trust were purely in the battle to save commons. And they came up with a very interesting idea in a paper that Robert Hunter wrote to a conference in 1884, which was about forming local land committees to create or preserve land around major conurbations and towns for the benefit of the people of those towns. So, bearing that in mind, I've taken it upon myself, in a way, to carry that spirit through. So I think we really do need a new commons movement in the same way that Robert Hunter and Octavia Hill set out a long time ago. And I don't know whether we can do it. And I have to put my hand up here. I work for a state agency. So I'm trying to convince the state that they should be doing this in a small way, but actually leading that kind of role for the wider benefit of society. And in doing so, I'm trying at this very moment in time to push the creation of new common lands and the creation of new common rights for everybody to do in whatever multiple land use way they can conceive of, subject to their circumstances. The availability of land, of course, is a big problem. There isn't a huge amount around here, but there are areas of green space which could be created as new commons in this very same way and stimulate for the everyman the interest that they have a stake in that, so they become, in the popular political term, a genuine stakeholder. Even if it's just, as Octavia Hill invented the expression in the 1880s, to have a right of air and exercise.
I'm fascinated by what I see emerging connection between what Duncan is saying about the need for a new commons movement, and what I heard Andrew saying about the political mobilization, the pub debates, and what I experienced since the beginning of this seminar series is a very uplifting surprise that, in spite being in the business of commons education as a school of commoning, we didn't know about a lot of commons that are happening and struggles for the commons that are happening. So convening this seminar series gave us the possibility, the kind of attractor or visibility that people coming and telling about their work, and then I just realized that so there is definitely not only a need but a possibility for what James was calling the commons as the political framework, or what Tim was telling at the very beginning of how to make voters, how to tell the story so that it can become an issue for the voters. What I see is one of the couple of things that is needed. One is one is definitely a close collaboration with NEF and the School of Commoning, because the main reason we created this seminar series is to bring the commons into the forefront of national discussion, and we are a much smaller organization than NEF, so after this conversation it would be good to explore more in depth what can we do together. And another thought that since we started paying attention to how politicians relate to the commons, well, we noticed that Ed Miliband was talking about commons being the basis of good society. That's his version of big society, but of course I would never argue with that commons is the basis of good society, but he is speaking from a moral perspective, and what he thinks that everybody would agree with it, and it's a good sign that he thinks that people would agree with it. But we need much more than just a moral perspective that is needed, but we need the kind of socio-economic case stories and prototypes and things that work and tell the story. So what I would add to it, that an interesting bit of information, that when we published a press release about this seminar series, the only place from the political parties that picked it up, it was the Lib Dems. So this was published on some of the Lib Dem websites, and some Lib Dem people came to the seminar. So and I think that the commons should be an issue really beyond party politics. So developing the narrative that can make it so that it's not that the commons needs the parties, it's the parties needs the commons vote, and for that I think that we need to develop the commons movement as an autonomous movement with clearly articulating its agenda, its policy requirement, and let the politicians compete for the commons vote.
I think the barriers to it are trying to find a language and an explanation that work as ever for us, work as effectively as the language and the seductive nature of the politics of the right. I still think, in terms of, the commodification of what's held in common, or what's held in public, the personalisation, the choice, the supposed efficiency, they still win. Even when reality's caught up with them and they've been exposed, they still kind of instinctively seem to win on that stuff. So I think we've got to challenge them, on all of that stuff. But the reality of the politics of markets that are too free and states that are too remote do open up, I think, a real space. But we'd have to work to get a language and a set of policies to kind of pin people like Ed Miliband down. And Dan and I were at a meeting last week discussing kind of this sort of stuff, and someone said that, you know, the issue with all of this stuff about creating new spaces, spheres, commons, etc., is that people are going to have to occupy them, are going to have to spend time in them. And that means going to more meetings, right? I mean, you know, the thing about socialism being, you know, to go to more meetings, yeah, and that's a problem, right? So this is all part of a kind of circular debate of, you know, finding the time, having a more seductive notion of what the good society and the good life is, and therefore cherishing these places, which are unique in terms of their ability to derive, you know, as the title says, common goods.
So the first starting point is that all land has multiple usages, and we're quite lucky that we're a large landowner, so we have lots of different land that we can look at how we can use that. But there is a big challenge, is that a lot of the land that we need for the commons is owned by other people. So there's a first, I suppose, a radical solution or a democratic solution to that, however you want to go about it. But certainly within the land that we own, we need to be much more savvy about how we can deliver multiple objectives, and that might not just be allowing people to carry on shooting, it might be about access, it might be about energy, it might be about biomass or other areas that we can do. So we've kind of looked at it and thought, most recently out back of planning, is how can we use systems like neighbourhood planning almost as a radical localism. I said not to use the word radical, but, but as a kind of practical localism of how you can use that as a disruptive model. And then starting off with the kind of land capability tool by looking at how you can do that. And we're calling the whole process spirit of place. So we look back to the heritage of what people value, what they love. So kind of the deep NIMBY stuff that people like to kind of see us for, what people value. And then look to the future about what I want to achieve with a place. And then look at how you can use neighbourhood planning in what we would see as traditional community organising, going in there, talking to people what you've got. Now the next trick is where we probably need to find resource, and this is where people like Co-op have been really helpful, is that how can you then bring in consultants or finance to help do that? So in terms of radical localism, it's saying why should large energy companies run our assets, whether that might be wind and planning permission locally or other things, but actually that should be community owned, and it shouldn't be about community benefit either. Putting a new scout hut up because you're making millions of pounds off the moors around your home is not right. It should be about community ownership. And I think with the right resources coming in, so we've been doing it on energy. The most recent one I saw last week was an area of space where we had some old ancient apple trees. We just turned a new allotment. But in that, we built a community festival into that village. So we looked at cultural commons as well. So it's looking at those very practical, and I think Duncan's got a whole list of, in an essay, it's probably worth sending around, of different areas which could be recommoned. And this is the new commons. But by piecing those together and then looking at a more holistic approach, which maybe neighbourhood planning or something could provide, with good financing and good consultancy to build those community renewables of sizable, you know, we're talking about big pieces of kit, whether it's community hydro or something. It's not necessarily just a small wind turbine on the side of a scout hut. This is big kit. And then good community organising about how you have that conversation in a way that's not pushing a radical political agenda maybe. It's just empowering people to look at what they got, what skills they got, putting finance and resources with that and start delivering these. And the more we can deliver and join up, before you know it, we can start recommoning areas. And I do think it's that simple, and the case studies are out there. But like climate change and energy efficiency, if you bolt them enough together, we've got all the solutions to stop climate change. It's just we haven't put them in one place. I think the commons is a similar story, but I think we need to get away from looking at some utilitarian techniques. Actually, it's cultural, it's heritage, it's much wider. It's, you know, it's just some of the stuff that Anthony Crossland had talked about making it artistic and interesting, and you know, so that's kind of where we're coming from the trust. But it'd be good to hear practical, how people have other ideas what people are doing out there.
In Sweden, which was thought of as being an ideal place, we have a huge problem with densification, it's called. It's the latest trend among planners, and it's in the name of the environment. They say that if we have dense cities, that will save energy on people being moved around. So the last vestiges of parks and things in Swedish cities are being built on by people making a lot of money from doing so in the name of the environment. So we have to, fighting the ongoing enclosure is another way, I think, of engaging people, which works.
Actually, in saying that, you know, currently we have a major financial crisis, and which is affecting people in their everyday lives in terms of how they view the system, etc. And we have a bit of a political crisis as well, as we're seeing through different countries. So I wonder whether I could ask whether people had some thoughts on two things that are coming out. One of them is actually to go back to what Tony was saying about money, and given that that is at the root, that issue about how we've got ourselves into a situation where debt has become such a large issue, and we are driven by decisions made by people who are very, very remote to the reality of ordinary people. And whether there's something there that, rather than theoretically, actually there's something to be said about the commons that actually cuts it in terms of being able to, politically and media-wise, I don't know. And the other one, sorry to mix them up together, but there's been quite a few things said around the idea of democracy, actually, from Magna Carta through to the stuff about land committees or whatever else, or indeed Neil's thing about people having to find more time to go to bloody meetings left, right and centre. But that idea of engaging people that they're more than just a voter or a consumer, but they are actually about more than that. Is there something to make that sound attractive or politically poignant, or is that really just a sort of, again, is that just a theoretical thing that can be put aside?
With a lot of real life individuals who are called commoners legally. What they really impressed upon me was this amazing duality of control. The commoners on one side taking what was called, and it's a French term, the profit of the soil, as it was called, i.e. grass that their cattle could graze, and then they could take things from their cattle, or they could take fallen boughs that fell on the ground, they could use them in their houses, in the way we would use plastics today. What it taught me was that the balance of power was very circulatory, and nobody, even though we inherited again from the Norman French connections the concept of the land being owned by somebody but other people having rights over it, that balance in exercise became very technical, and it also became the foundation of small democracies everywhere. Because you could always debate, not just about, as in Hardin's tragedy, about resource depletion if your soil failed to produce the grass that your cattle ate, but also the relationships between people in the control of that vital common resource, land itself, or in the case of marine, the seas and the products of the seas. And it became a debating chamber from which a lot of very democratic principles emerged, because people were genuinely stakeholders, empowered to say, I have a right to say what I want to say, you can't take these things away from me. So it became a really, really powerful sense, and every individual conveyed that power in the way they spoke about their common rights, in the way that we could speak about our common rights, but we don't. We're not empowered to do that. That's why I think it's very important to actually get that point over, that we're as empowered as anybody else to talk about the things that are common to all of us, the air we breathe or whatever. We need to find that metaphor and make it stick.
From the people I talk to in finance and in banking, they've picked up that the commons is a buzzword, and that they're trying to co-opt it, just as they've talked about sustainable money or sustainable finance, and kind of water down the word till it's meaningless. That hasn't happened yet, but I mean, it's not meaningless yet, but I see them dabbling around the edges of it. The Pentagon is talking about full spectrum dominance of the United States in terms of commons. Outer space, the oceans, land masses, that sort of thing, and they're calling it commons. The global commons have to be coordinated and managed for the benefit of humanity in the future, and they're picking up a lot of the language of the commons movement, which gets back to the whole reason why we're here. That we've really got to bring this forward quickly, and we are ahead of the curve because we've done more research than they have. Because they're just dabbling in using commons as a metaphor. We're using it as a really structural principle, and we have the power of making it a very salient political issue. Now, the point about finance and economics at this point is everything, really, because it is a power struggle over the money system, and it's a power struggle that finance is exceedingly aware of. But I think finance can be ultimately on our side, because finance is also struggling with the same problems we're struggling with, which is a very unstable monetary system. So finance isn't a natural partner with monetary people or bankers. They're actually, in many cases, adversaries, or there's an adversarial relationship there oftentimes. The financiers I've talked to really are interested in finding ways of financing trusteeships, and not all of them, but there's enough, 10% of the people in the finance world that I've talked to have that inclination that they would want to turn to financing these kinds of new structures that are coming forward, however the commons would be managed. But there's the larger question of, as I'd said earlier, how the international monetary system is going to find a new asset base for the future. And what I think a lot of people in the central banks are realizing is that they could probably extend neoliberalism well into the future by creating regional monetary structures like the European Union or the North American Union or Mercosur, which would reduce the ecological footprint through greater market efficiency, might save us in the midst of a monetary crash. But what does it give us? It gives us the same structure as we have now, hyper-competitive now between states, now in the future hyper-competitive between regions that share the same monetary structure. And obviously the lessons of the European Union now are showing us that you can't rush ahead and create a European monetary union without having political buy-in, particularly from people. The issue now then is that what are the assets going to be to underpin a new value system in the future? And that's why I introduced this with epistemology at the first place, because that's where it all starts. It's the resources, but it's people. Value doesn't come from people themselves, just by people themselves. It doesn't come from the resources themselves. It's both, plus the relationship between the people and the resources. And that's what's been missing largely in the debate. And this is what the commons people really can bring forward.
People have been talking about metaphors and symbols. I think there are practice symbols where you actually do it. And one of them is, for example, the Rambler movement or so on. And I think that the mass trespasses, but also the national park movement and these other things that enabled working people to go into nature and walk together and do things together. I think that was part and parcel also of the labor movement. It gave it some kind of concrete grounding. But also for cooperative movements and banking with savings and loans, cooperative shops. And these are commons that have recently been stolen from us, I think, basically by new liberalism. All of a sudden they were gone. And I think that it makes for an interesting principle when you're talking about politics, in that the old-fashioned estates that Duncan was talking about, where someone may have owned the estate, but the commoners had rights in it. Basically, the state, you could say, might own a park or something, but people have rights in it. And the problem with, say, communism was that the state owned everything and nobody had any rights in it, and that was where it went wrong. And so I think that that's an interesting principle there. I think that, well, Elinor Ostrom is a wonderful person, and the economic approach that people have been talking about is important. It is also the dismal science, you might say. Maybe I shouldn't say that here, but
feel free.
it's problematically abstract for ordinary people. So it's important to have these higher principles, but something that people can actually do, like hike together, do things, makes the difference, I think.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, the commons is learning by doing, and in that sense, what I think happens in this talk, we've really kind of focused on the governance aspects, and we've lost the production aspects. And if the commons has to be in balance between the governance and the production, it's not only labor. It's now, what's driving a new kind of commoning ethic is the recognition of this co-production that is possible, and it's not just sort of a public-private partnership kind of thing, which actually has been co-opted by the neoliberal framework, but it's the idea that people become the consumers of their own production, and that's the exciting thing that always has to be right at the center, not just the decision making, but the actual production. And I think if Marx is credited for anything, I think bringing that point forward and keeping it front and center is important.
Cool. Duncan, then James.
Just a quickie. Because if anybody studied the language of commoners' committees, I know the National Trust has quite a few, and some of them are a bit problematical. They're very awkward people, because they have rights to be awkward. Long live the right to be awkward. But the language of these committees is about profit of prendre. It's about the profit of the soil. So it's very analogous to what you were saying about the language of banking systems. And of course, if your profit doesn't come up in the form of, say, grass, something as humble as grass, you don't put as many cows on it that year. You then monitor how it performs through that year, and if it's a dry year, the grass doesn't grow. So you're constantly monitoring and maintaining. And you do need law, because somebody needs to come along and say, oi, you can't put 10 cows on there this year because the grass isn't growing. So there is all this monitoring and all this regulation and all this control that goes into that humble system based on something as simple as grass growing out of the ground. Now, if you can transform that and the language of those commoners' committees into any international financial system, A, good luck, but B, it would give you a lot of education in how those things work in small realities.